Welcome, everybody, to another episode of our Coda Maker Stories. It's a great pleasure to have all of you with us today on this Tuesday afternoon, morning, evening, or middle of the night, depending on where you are in this wonderful world of ours. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name's Maria Marquis, and here at Coda, I focus on education, outreach, and just in general celebrating the people who are doing the work in Coda out there on the streets. Just so all of you know how today's session is going to work, at any point in time today, you can get in touch with us. There's no such thing as an interruption in these little virtual sessions. That's why we have the chat field along the right side of your screen where you can go ahead and post whatever's on your mind. Alice has already gotten us off to a great start. Fantastic. And we also have the questions option at the bottom of your screen. So right below our faces, you'll see the Ask a Question button. We have a couple questions that were submitted beforehand today by one of my wonderful colleagues. She was very curious about what's going on today and learning more about this particular doc and this particular perspective. So you can use that at any time. And if you don't have a question for yourself, um, oh, indeed, yes. I was like, oh, that's my Jessica here. I got very confused. I was very excited. But if you see a question in the Ask a Question area that you also have, go ahead and just upvote it and downvote something you don't share that particular question with. We'll be more than happy to help. So today I'm joined by Jessica Powell. Jessica, do you want to introduce yourself to the group today so they know a little bit about who you are and your celebrity status?
Oh, yeah. I don't know how to introduce myself. My name's Jessica Powell. I've been at big tech companies. I've been at startups. I was at Google for like 1,000 years and eventually ran their communications team, but did a bunch of different things there up until then. And then I left, and now I have a startup called Audio Shake. And I also do a lot of writing at night, not really so much during the day. So I wrote a book called The Big Disruption, a totally fictional but essentially true Silicon Valley story. Always a hard title for me to say because I didn't actually come up with it myself, and so I kind of did it. And I write opinion pieces and particularly like humor pieces for the New York Times and some other outlets.
Awesome. Cool. I also love it's like 1,000 years ago, Google was doing like searching for things on rocks. Like, what did you find here? Like, all that. Awesome. So what we're going to talk about today is this doc that captures Jessica's whole approach to one-on-ones. And I think before we take a look at the doc, Jessica, I think it'd be really interesting for folks to hear from you kind of how you developed this perspective, the experiences that you had in your work life that made you go, we need a better way to kind of figure out and quantify what this manager direct report relationship's all about. Could you share a little bit about your perspective and kind of where this came from?
Sure. I think it's very rare, or at least in my work experience, it's very rare that anyone teaches you how to be a manager. And it's rare that anyone teaches you how to run a one-on-one, which as business jargony as a one-on-one is, it's basically just a meeting and a way for you to catch up with and guide the person you're working with, right? And so actually it's super, super important, and particularly for the employee. And yet no one really ever shows us how to do it or gives us tips a lot of times on how to do it.
Yeah.
And so I found that I certainly was in that bucket. No one ever showed me, and I would just kind of cobble together over the years things I thought that worked based on either good or bad managers I'd had. And yet whether I was managing 2 people or eventually I think I managed, throughout the org,
Sure.
like 300 or something people, I always ran one-on-ones. And I found that, again, regardless of the size, having some sort of consistent framework for how to think about that, so always keeping it flexible, was really, really important.
Yeah, it's always interesting, when you are promoted to be a manager, it's usually because you are really good at being an individual contributor. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait, all the things that made me good at that don't work here. And like, okay, I hated that when my manager did this in a one-on-one. So I guess,
and now I'm supposed to talk to them all.
yeah, it's like, do I do the opposite now? Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen since I have your doc up here. And if you could just do me a favor, let me know when you can see it. And I'm just going to make that a
Yep.
little bigger. Cool. All right. Excellent. Also, just a reminder, everybody, you don't need to wait for us to stop talking. If you've got a question, an idea, anything, you can always just let us know. Please feel free to pop those in wherever you like. Also, if you are looking for getting a copy of this doc for yourself, I'm just going to go ahead and pop the link over there in chat. You can go ahead and steal it, make a copy, and make it your own. So in this case, this first page, this is really like the kind of a peek inside your mind. Yeah, Jessica, this idea of the different pieces of needing sort of the foundation for a one, having that expectation, getting into always having an agenda, and then thinking about how do you start to track your goals and then making those different customizations here. If you think about someone coming in to this particular doc, is there anything that you would recommend that they really take a close look at here on this first page? Anything that really pops for you as kind of a mission critical aspect of it?
Sure. I mean, I guess two answers I would have to that. First, I would say before you even read anything, if you have a minute or two to think about what matters to you as someone who's managed. Unless you're the CEO, in which case you're just a dictator and like, great, you're probably not on this call. You're probably like opining on the color of the lights in your office. Well, you're old. But assuming you've got a manager, like think about the things that are important to you, you're kind of your wish list, right? The things that work well, the things that don't work well, before you even look at anything I've said. Because I do think that personal experience, at a minimum, will show you how different other people's experiences are and what they need. And you always want to retain a really flexible approach, I think, to one-on-ones. Having said all that, what I tried to focus on in this document were sort of three things. The first was, and they're all kind of, they all swirl or kind of are adjacent to this idea of the one-on-one. So one is around expectation setting. The second, and I think there's a paragraph that specifically talks about these three categories.
Yeah.
Expectation setting, having a focused agenda, having an agenda, right? That's really important.
Just
then,
there.
Yeah, and then finding a way to connect short-term and long-term goals. And should I stop there? Or should I say more?
Yeah, feel free to say more. I think this is great to just be able to understand a little bit more about, kind of double clicking on this and kind of seeing inside your mind here. Yeah.
Sure. So let's start with expectation setting. I think that's the first category in the document.
Yeah.
One of the things that's always been really surprising to me, and I imagine a lot of people on the call have had a similar experience, is it's very easy to assume, like to project your own experience and what you want onto your reports or onto your manager, and think that everyone's kind of communicating the same, or they want to be communicated with in the same way.
Yeah.
But people are so different. So in my case, I learned over the years that I hate I hate having something presented to me. I process stuff a lot better if it's given to me in advance and I can read it and have a time to think about it on my own versus doing it in the moment with someone in front of me. A lot of people are not like that. I also, that's kind of just how I process information as your manager, how I would want you to send something to me in advance. But you're not going to know that if I don't tell you that. Another thing as a manager, I tried really hard to never email anyone over the weekend. And so I had kind of a thing where it's like, if there's something truly urgent, I'm going to call you. And I would just tell them that ahead of time. Like, you should never be feeling like you have to check your email from me over the weekend. I won't call you. But again, lots of people don't do that. And they're horrible about email weekend and creating like work for their employees.
Yeah.
So if you don't kind of so there are two very, very different examples. One just has to do with how I like to receive information, which might be quite different from how my employee likes to do it. Another is kind of, what are my expectations, and this is not necessarily me being good, could be very much criticized. I will email you anytime during the day, during the week. I may not expect you to respond, but you can expect that you may get an email from me at 11 o'clock at night, just because that's sort of who I am. But I kind of keep the weekend sacred. And again, so it's just trying to lay that out for people to know what they expect, and getting the same thing from your employee. How do they like to work? What are their goals, right? Particularly when you start managing, probably at all levels, but I think particularly as someone advances in their career, the things that they want to target start to transition a little bit more to, I don't know if it's softer skills, but they're not technical skills, whatever your discipline or area is. And so working with them through like, what are the kind of more personal development areas that they want to target? And do they want to get feedback on that regularly, or do they want to just get it every so often? So just establishing expectations both on the manager side and the employee side. And by that, I don't mean some super long, heartfelt document, full of emojis. Just like a couple of key things that you would say to someone of like, this is the guide to working with me.
Yeah.
And so you set expectations and you kind of have agreements again, like around how you're going to work together, how often you're going to meet, right? Like, are you going to meet once a week? Are you going to meet, less frequently than that?
I really like this because it's kind of like having a user manual, right? Where it's like, okay, how do I really incorporate feedback best? Do I like to have it as a heads up? How do I process information? And kind of defining your terms, right? Because if we are, working together, we can both agree like good communication is critical, but my definition might be completely different than yours. And then we struggle because we're using the same words to talk about very different experiences. And I just like where it's like, here, I'm not going to make you guess how to work with me. I'm going to just put this down and we're going to both agree how we're going to work together, it's a simple solution for something that can have really huge resonating effects. Love that. Awesome. Anything else on this section that you think is important for folks to know, or areas where you might recommend that they make adjustments or customize?
No, I'd say just common sense, right? Those are just some examples, but things that you think are that you've learned about yourself over the years, again, without bearing your soul, but just that you think would be helpful to someone to know about you.
And then, of course, I love that there's this little bit of setup here where you and your direct report can put your email addresses in, because how this doc is designed has a bit of an email connection, because we all know that email is where a lot of things happen, for better or for worse. And I like that we've built that in here, which is pretty great. All right, so let's take a look at the next section, which is sort of these two that work together, the active agenda and the past agenda area. So Jessica, what are your opinions on like the best way to approach developing an agenda, and kind of who should drive and how should it be driven? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, there are definitely people I've met that kind of like to improvise and don't like to have an agenda. I'm sure that does work for some people, but I think particularly as a manager, you should work with the assumption that having some sort of structure and having some sort of expectation and accountability on both sides is sort of the default. And unless you naturally end up migrating to some kind of thing where it is totally free flowing, I think you want to have some kind of roadmap, because that's like, we all, I think, from even like our small startup, we're still all very small. We all have basically the same OKRs. We all know what we're doing. We still know where we're going, right? We still have a roadmap, right? And that's essentially what an agenda is too. And it's just like this short-term thing of what you want to talk about. And it's giving clarity and putting everyone on the same page in terms of what are the important things. Because what can happen on a sort of, you can, with all the best intentions, end up with really pointless, but sort of feel good catch-ups without it. So on the manager side, just kind of coming in and not having received an agenda from your employee, and you just start talking about the meetings you've had or talking to them about kind of what's going on in their life. And there's value to that stuff. A lot of management is, of course, like the interpersonal stuff too. But when the employee walks out of there, unless they were needing kind of a feel-good session, you've given them very little. You haven't given feedback on the stuff that they actually need feedback on, whether they know it or not. And you, on your side, are not any more informed about the status of the project. And you have, and the whole point of you being a manager was to kind of coach this person along and oversee, with varying degrees of heavy-handedness, their work, and you've gotten none of that. Whereas an agenda forces, at the very least, it is a piece of paper or virtual paper that's saying, here are the things we're going to talk about, and here's kind of the status around them. I also think it makes it much easier, I guess we'll get to this afterwards, to map short and long-term goals. Again, if you never write anything down, you never have goals or agendas, how are you ever going to measure any sort of progress? So on the for the agenda part, if you go,
we'll head back.
I guess. All right. Okay.
Cool.
So I guess we'll skip to the goals part. Maybe we should actually start with goals. Is that
okay? Yeah. Do you want to hop into the goals section?
Yeah.
Cool.
Sure.
All right. Here we are in
Okay.
goals.
So the goals thing, particularly if you're in a larger company or, I mean, even medium sized, and they have a whole framework for how they do OKRs or KPIs or whatever you want to call them, you may not need this document. But I'll explain kind of what I was trying to solve for, and then it might be helpful to see how you bridge that with whatever you use in your existing companies. So one thing I saw is that I would get employees that would come in with really solid agendas. We would make a lot of progress. And then we'd get to like halfway through the quarter or the end of the quarter, and actually a lot of the quarterly goals we had set had fallen by the wayside. Now,
Yes.
that's going to probably be more problematic in certain functions versus others. But I just think that the nature of being in a company means you are getting hit by all kinds of things. Sometimes they're distractions. Sometimes they're like very necessary fire drills. But it's easy to get off course, right? There's a reason launches get pushed or like big projects don't happen in the quarter that they're supposed to be delivered. And so having some kind of way to reference these long-term goals in the agenda, I thought was an interesting exercise to go through. And even if you're not necessarily going to want to update on a quarterly goal every single weekly meeting, but even having them there and just having kind of the status of, on track or whatever. And then you and the manager can decide whether or not to dive into it. But otherwise, they kind of exist as totally distinct documents, right? Your OKR document, your KPI document, and this agenda thing that's like on a notebook that you're walking into the office with.
Yes.
So I wanted to find a way to unite those. And so I thought maybe this was a lightweight version to do that, where you weren't having to write a really, really long, super detailed OKR document, which probably exists elsewhere in your company. So anyway, so using this document, the goals thing, you would just list out again. I was thinking you would list it as a really high level. Though of course you could go into more detail of what those goals are. We put some examples here. And then you go into the agenda document, and the agenda document has already pulled from the goals, so they're there. And again, there are going to be weeks where you want to touch on those with your manager, or your manager wants an update, and other weeks where it's not relevant at all. That's sort of the top part. The second part is kind of interesting in the sentiment part of how people are feeling. With some employees, it's going to feel really weird and you're not going to want to include it, and that's fine. You can let them decide whether to do it, or you can decide whether to include it in your template. But I feel like a lot of times people would come into my office and we would spend, say, 20 minutes talking about all these other things. And in the last 5 minutes, we'd actually really get to a big issue that was on their mind, something that was really stressing them out at work. Maybe it could be something personal. It could have been that, the person's manager, VP, whatever, got yelled at and they need help navigating it, but they didn't feel like they could come in right away and start talking about it. And so in some way, for some employees, having a way to signal in advance that things aren't good, but in a way that doesn't feel like you're prying open their soul over an automated email.
Totally.
Like it's a kind of way for them, you as the manager, for them to kind of signal to you that something's not right. You're going to get tons of people like, it's fine, even though they're dying inside.
Yes, I'm perfectly great.
Yeah, like everyone in the pandemic, right? Like everything's fine. But I thought it was an interesting thing to play with, and with certain employees, I thought it could work well. I definitely found over the years that certain employees did want to always start off kind of talking about their general state of things as then a way to get into the work piece of it.
Totally.
So that's the second part.
And I would say you mentioned something that, depending on how you feel or, what you're comfortable with, this may feel more or less appropriate. But just calling out that if you make a copy of this doc, you could then just change what the values in this drop-down menu are. You could just have it be stars, or you could have it be, just images. You could have it be your own terminology just by editing whatever's in the select list. So if this doesn't feel authentic to you, you can always make the change to make it feel more authentic, as with everything else in this doc too. Sorry to interrupt, Jessica.
Create a category that's just like crushing it, and make that the only option for your employees every single week.
Just the best.
So that's the second category. And then you get into kind of what I would see as the real meat of your meeting, which is the topics for discussion. So that's, again, asking your employee to flag for you in advance, have them go through the act of thinking, I have 30 minutes with my manager or whatever it is. What are the big things I want to talk about? And they're actually just going to fill this out, right? And it could be like update on project number 1. issue with like the onboarding flow.
Mm-hmm.
Topic 3 could be something else. It might just be one big topic. It might be 5. Like I definitely had meetings at Google where I would just go into a meeting with Sundar and have one thing I needed to talk about for a very long time. And then other times it was like 10 really small, annoying things that I just needed to run through really quickly.
Yeah.
But I always sent him an agenda in advance because I was like, I need him to see that we need to go over these 10 things. And so I don't want anyone to like cut short my time or anything like that. Like I need that full like time that we've been allotted. And then again, if someone was working for me and because they would have known in advance that I like to see materials in advance, a lot of times they would probably be linking to the materials as well. And then I think what I really liked about building the doc and what was interesting to me was the fact that you could, again, pull from all of these different docs or areas into one email that gets sent to both the manager and the employee. It creates a bit of a paper trail where you can always go back and look at stuff. It also creates like conveniently a paper trail of links, right? Like if I'm all of a sudden in a management meeting and someone's asking me for the update on a certain project, I literally could just go to this rather than digging through my email trying to find the time that someone emailed me a particular doc.
Massive keyword searching of like, I don't know.
Doc search is still pretty bad. So that like I really like trying to bring everything together in one. I also think it again just reinforces a certain level of accountability between the employee and the manager. Like we did talk about this thing at this point, and here's what you told me and whatnot. And the note thing would be a place where either could record kind of action items coming out of the meeting, or things to follow up on, or things that they want to things that they might want to cover in the next meeting.
Totally. One thing I really like about how this section is crafted is that you are really sort of balancing both making it them driven, areas I would like to discuss. That's putting all of the power in the direct report's hands to say, here's what's important to me. But then also there's like a little bit of the manager presence here of like, would you like to share more? I'm interested. I'm here if you want it. There's like that balance of the two sides, which I think is really well done here. And I really love that. And one thing to call out, you mentioned this idea of processing time, so being able to email out the agenda and notes. I actually have a copy of the doc over here in another tab where I can show you underneath the hood, everybody who's with us, what this is looking like. What we're doing here is we're using the Gmail pack, so we're connecting Coda and Gmail together. And here's that same button. I'm just going to right click on it to open up all of its goodies and details underneath. So here we're just choosing to send an email from, in this case, my Gmail account, since this is my doc, and then to the 2 email addresses that we added in expectations. The subject is just saying the meeting for, and then whatever today is, and then it is also including whoever you are. So the meeting for today with Maria Marquis. So here you can see what that would look like. And then we're just sending out this particular section. So that would just go out ahead of time. You can go ahead and make that happen. And because I would be remiss in my duties if I didn't go, oh, you could also do, one of the things you could do is you could go over to your gear menu and automations. And you could set up an automation to push this button, an hour before your one-on-one every day, so that it automatically goes out ahead of time, or whatever the agreed allotment of time before the meeting where you'd like to get the information. So just a little bit of a pro tip there. Thank you for coming along on my detour. Anything else on this particular sort of the active agenda area, Jessica, that you think is helpful for folks to know?
No, I think riffing off of one thing you said, which I think is just really important, is if you're a manager, to think of the one-on-one really as like 90% of it should be for your direct report, and should be them setting the agenda and coming to you and you helping them solve their problems, right? I've just been in so many one-on-ones where you hear the manager kind of use that one-on-one as a chance to vent or a chance to like just chat because they've had a lot of meetings that day or whatever. And you just kind of have to remember that this is, say, the 30 minutes of the week that person gets with your time. And it's probably going to be much more valuable to them than to you. I think that becomes even more the case when you're dealing with remote employees who are less connected to the company. I mean, we all are in this state right now, but I'm saying in general. And so making sure that you, without killing yourself trying to do this, but that you're flexible in terms of how the one-on-one is run and what its like topics are, but that's largely being driven by the employee. And obviously, if you don't think they're running it well, that's a separate thing that you need to tackle. But my point is that you need to be flexible and not assume it's a one-size-fits-all approach. And that you're also making good use of their time. That it's not just about like whether it's a waste of your time. Like you need to really be thinking like, am I delivering a good experience for my report in the way this one-on-one is being run and the way we're interacting?
Yeah. Well, and I found in my experience, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, one-on-one that goes like kind of poorly can then have those trickle down effects of like every time then you meet one-on-one with that person, the quality can start to degrade if there's not that attention and that rigor to making it something that's valuable. It's like, oh, this manager actually just wants to talk to me, so I'll just show up and I'll do my 30 and then we're on their way. You're probably not going to get that feedback of like, hey, this is not working for me until it might be too late, right?
Right.
Awesome. So active agenda here. Then we also have the past agenda area. So can you talk through a little bit about how you think about sort of note taking over time and where this fits inside of a sort of your recommended process?
Oh yeah, this was just me projecting my own
Love it.
my own problems here. I am a horrible note taker. Like I'll take like 3 notes during an hour-long meeting and think that somehow my memory is going to just push me through everything, whether it's a one-on-one or like some briefing session. And so what I liked about the idea of just, well, first of all, it's so easy to do. If you're already generating a record of the one-on-one, why wouldn't you just have a running record of it, right? And that's something you could go back into. I just liked that much more than what I found that I would often do, which was try and find the random Google Doc where I had recorded some notes or like a Post-it note. And like, I just wanted to find a way that was a little bit more like a way to collect the notes, sort of Evernote style or whatever it might be. I just wanted to put it all in one place because I thought that was easier to go back to and look at. And again, just to go back to what I was saying, I think having a running list, it makes it a lot harder to get off track. It also creates accountability on both the side of the manager and the employee, right? If the employee, like one of the things that just always blows my mind when you get to performance reviews, which is a whole other like puddle of fish. But in the so the manager all through the process, like during the quarter, won't have flagged a particular problem, or the employee will not have flagged a particular problem with a project. You get then to the quarter, end of the quarter, and the performance review comes and it's bad, and the employee's upset. And maybe they're upset because they feel like they've been actually raising this issue the whole time that the manager is criticizing them for, and the manager meanwhile just hasn't been paying that much attention. You have an agenda, basically it's like a record of everything you guys covered. Like that's a lot harder to do. And at the same time, also like flipping that scenario, I think sometimes employees think that their managers are more in the loop on certain things than they really are. And so maybe the employee really did drop the ball and wasn't discussing this thing, the way that they thought they were, just because they sent some random email update at some point in time.
Totally.
I think like it's just about creating accountability. I don't think it's the most important part of the document at all. I think fundamentally the most important part is having an agenda and having and then behind that having expectation setting on both sides about what's expected. But I think this is sort of a nice thing to have if you ever want to go back and look what was covered, or if there are meeting notes and links that you want to refer to. It's much easier than to try and dig through email.
Totally. And even just, I think if you're getting ready to go for your next one-on-one, to be like, wait, what were we talking about last time? Oh, I can just go back there, see, oh, I actually have this new update, or here was something that was flagged. And then even on your comment about performance reviews, when I sit down and have to do my self-reflection, or if I'm a manager and I'm getting ready to put together a really comprehensive review, I've got this full list and I can use it to kind of jog my memory and remind myself of exactly what we were talking about in looking for those trends. And in this case, the doc, it's a pretty simple, you just go from your active agenda and you just copy paste into that past agenda area. So pretty straightforward. There's not a, big fancy, like you have to go through all these hoops. You just kind of copy paste and then you're on your way. Yeah. Nice. Cool.
I was actually just thinking it actually is also very useful if you're having to write performance reviews at the end, and depending on how your company runs them, if you have to give all these concrete examples of things, and if you have a ton of employees, you're like, I know this person's really good, and I know they did this one thing, but I feel like I have to add more text. All this is stupid. Again, separate issue around performance reviews.
For sure.
You can just dip into this and be like, When Maria ran that one presentation, copy paste from the thing.
Just gonna
Anyway,
put that over
bad
here.
manager tricks, but like it is helpful.
Yeah, well, and it's one of those things where, we do want to get to a point where we're able to have something that is high fidelity, but also something that isn't going to be taking, hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, because then that's part of the process starts to break down too, because a process is only as good as how easy it is to follow it, right?
Right.
Excellent. Anything else around this doc that you want to show people or call out?
I don't think so. I'm interested in hearing if people have questions or
Yeah, for
other ideas.
sure. Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. All right. So again, folks, you can always just click on ask a question, add it there, put it over in chat. Either one works for me. But I've got two questions here right now, which is the first one is what are the biggest managing up mistakes that people make in their mid-level career? So we're trying to, own our career. We're trying to give that upward feedback. How can that go awry? How have you seen that not work?
I mean, part of me wants to say you should never manage up, and it's such a horrible bureaucratic thing. I guess the realistic part is that we all have to do it to a certain degree. I think one thing that is helpful for me, at least, I'm kind of more on the introverted side, and I found it really hard in some places where I worked, where I thought people were very competitive, and that you really had to kind of shout about what you were doing. And that just didn't feel very natural to me. But at the same time, I recognized that you kind of had to do it. And so I found that very, very hard to navigate. And I'm not sure if I ever did it well. But one thing that I realized at some point when I started managing people that then helped me in my own way of doing it was that if managing up is, and maybe definitionally, I don't, tell me if this is not what the question asker is.
Sure, yeah.
Managing up is essentially making sure that your manager and other people that can influence your career and your salary know what you're doing. Then I think one way to look at it is there a way for me to share work that has a benefit beyond just myself? And at least for me, that was important because otherwise I felt incredibly egotistical. And so I would say, all right, like we just ran this project in Germany and in France and in Spain. And each time we did it, like we iterated on it to improve it. If we could share that with the US team, right? And share the different changes we were making along the way of, and what were the different kind of problems that we encountered. And what were like the key learnings and so forth that we did. That actually all of a sudden is not bragging. It's actually useful to the US team. And so what I tried to think about it that way also when I would be, if I knew that there was this big project we had done that I wanted to share with my manager at the time. And I knew it was going to make me and my team look good. And so I needed to share it. It was a big project of ours. It was one of the goals that would have been on that document we were talking about. So I would think about it as, okay, well, I'd always have a section in there about what we did wrong. And that would help me, right? So it's like brag, metric, and then be like, here's what we did wrong. Here's how we do it differently next time. And for me, at least, that kind of mental model of I'm either sharing information that can help you do your job better. That's sort of like peer-to-peer sharing, which also your managers above are going to see too. So, but still. And then there's like directly managing up and saying, all right, well, what could we do better? Like what I would always try and look for the negative or the critical, constructive, critical parts of it too, because that made it easier for me to send on. So for me as a manager, or when I was running a large organization where I saw managing up go wrong, or where I personally kind of cringed and I feel like it did not give the person brownie points, but I think this is very personal, is when I felt like the person was taking all the credit for something, when I felt like it was very much about them and not about the team, when I didn't see value beyond their personal brand, so to speak, in what they were sharing. I also think people can't, so that's the first part, which is again, it probably depends on the company culture you're in, but I would say humility is always really important. So trying to think if there's value. Also just for your peers, you don't want your peers to hate you.
Yeah,
right?
That's good, right?
So finding ways that what you can share, the ways that you share your success can be helpful to other people, I think is a way to maybe find a good middle ground and all that. The other thing I would say is, I think that people that manage up too much will make other mistakes.
Hmm.
So I remember working for someone who was obsessed with impressing a particular business leader. I'm like abstracting all this right now.
Mm-hmm.
Can't figure out who it was. So it was obsessed with like impressing a particular business leader. And so all of that person's activities were like overly concerned with how it would be perceived by that leader.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, it was like a weird political move that was like a poor political calculation, because it meant that they weren't actually addressing other people in the company that were also stakeholders in what they were doing. And I just think that's so exhausting,
Yeah,
right?
I know. I'm tired just thinking about it. Like, oh
Yeah,
gosh.
and you can just see it a lot in big companies.
Yeah.
So I think also if you get to a point where it's not about the work itself, and instead it's sort of trying to figure out how you position the work vis-a-vis other people. I'm sure in some companies that is probably like the political reality of working there, but I think that's a really exhausting way to think about your job. And so
Yeah.
I think trying to avoid that.
And it's interesting in hearing you talk about that. It's almost like by expanding your perspective of how does this impact the wider people? How can I help as many people as possible? It actually gives you more influence because of that humility. It's not that, I'm just going after this one laser thing and that's all I'm taking. But
That's what
by
I'd like
opening it
to
up,
believe. I'd
you
like to
know?
believe that they're also total bastards and jerks that do incredibly well in a company environment.
Yeah.
That's probably the ones that rule the world. But like,
Mm.
if you want to also like have friends at the same time, I think that's probably the better way to do it.
True. So if you're an asshole, go ahead and do the
Ignore
very
everything I said, and you
ignore everything. If you don't
don't
want
be
to be a
a
butthead,
yeah.
go with that advice. I love that. Excellent. So we have another question here, which is kind of related, which is what are the common pitfalls of giving and receiving feedback, and how can you work around that? Thinking like inside of that one-on-one probably seems like a good way to ground this because it is a big topic.
Sure. I think, I actually wrote, so I have a column for Medium, uh, which I don't know how you find it. I think it's called Ask Jessica. It's on Medium. It's in their board publication.
Oh, cool.
But I think if you find me on Medium, then you'll see all the older ones. But there's one very
Nice.
specifically on this about giving feedback. I think that the biggest, and so that post probably will be a more coherent explanation of the bit that I will try and say right now. But I think that the biggest thing is to be honest. I think one of the biggest problems is that, particularly when we work in tech, I think, but maybe any sort of more modern workplace there and less traditional, we all want to be friends with each other. We, particularly in America, like we all like want to go play softball together, and so try and pretend hierarchies don't exist a lot of times when they really do. And so bosses try and act very chummy with their reports, which is nice, right? That's like a nice way to work every day. At the same time, you can bet that your employee does not think of you as like equal on the hierarchy line, no matter the fact that you're all going and getting beers afterwards. Like they are very aware of the fact that you control their salary or control their performance trajectory. And so you have to keep in mind that you have a certain duty and obligation to them in terms of what they expect from you. And so what happens a lot of times is during the course of a quarter, we will, as managers, tend to avoid conflict and avoid giving negative feedback because these are our friends or they're people that we want to have like us. And ultimately that doesn't serve the employee. It also doesn't serve your friendship, right? Because at the end of the day, you get to the performance reviews, and particularly if you're calibrating across multiple teams and employees, you are going to have to start ranking them. And meanwhile, here's this employee that you had given the feedback to that they needed to, I don't know, be more responsive, right? That they just would ignore emails from coworkers or whatever for days on end. And that you never really gave that feedback. That's an easy piece of feedback, but let's just say, but you never really gave that feedback. So nothing's changed during the quarter. You get to the end of the quarter, they get dinged again. And it's like, they're going to be pissed off about it. And of course, the behavior is on them, but if no one's telling them, and particularly you know that it's a problem, and you're not passing that on to them, like that's a problem. So, and I also think that, the people that I think the managers that employees appreciate the most are the ones that are able to give honest, not mean, feedback that's very much based in concrete evidence. And so you want to avoid kind of wishy-washy statements that you can't back up with examples. So again, if we're going back to this reliability thing, which to me is not the hardest piece of feedback to give, but like, again, to use that, it would be, you say like, Maria, I don't think I think we need to work a little bit more on reliability issues. For example, Jessica sent you an email 10 days ago, and she still hasn't had a response. I sent you an email, and yeah, you shouldn't have done that, Maria. And like so-and-so sent you an email and this didn't happen, or so-and-so gave you this huge project, or I nominated you for this big project and I was really excited and I know you've done a ton of work on it. But you're not actually getting back to everyone. And I know you hate email. I know that's hard for you. So like, let's talk about how we improve this, right? Like what are the kind of systems or what kind of things you need to have so that you remember to look at your email every day or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So again, not a great example off the top of my head, but the point is just that I think honesty and always being concrete in feedback are the most important and most missed things that managers do or don't do.
And that kind of comes back to, if I'm thinking about the doc, right, that expectations bit. We're not just saying like, yeah, we're going to meet and we'll be honest with each other, but like really being clear. Here is what I mean by our meeting cadence, and here's what I mean by my communication preferences. And by being concrete, it makes it much less likely that someone's going to get confused or someone is going to get hurt, right? We're all going to be able to work at our best. Love that. We have another question here, which is from Alice, which is, for one-on-ones with a skip manager or higher, are there any additional unique topics or sections you would add to this guide?
How bad your current manager is and how they I think that, I don't know if I have a specific thing off the top of my head. I would say always assume that the skip level manager like doesn't know what you do. And I mean, if you are very clear on them knowing part A of your project, fine. But I mean, your manager doesn't know a good percentage of what you do, which is actually, that's the state you're in. Sorry, if you have a micromanager, they do. But if you have a good manager that is hitting the right balance between, and again, that all depends on level, but between handholding and autonomy, they're going to have a good global overview of what you're doing. But then that global overview is going to get leveled up one more when it gets passed on to the skip level manager. And so just being able to context set. And if the person already knows, like they'll speed you along, but they also don't want to feel bad. Again, going back to this, like we're all friends here.
Yeah.
A lot of times you'll see people come in and they'll come in mid-project, like halfway through the story and start there. And you as the skip level manager, like, I don't know what you're talking about, but it's going to feel so rude that this is like this whole project's your life and I don't know it. So I would say like always just up level it a bit from the conversation you have with your manager, 1. 2, always assume that anything you say is going to go back to your manager. Now, if your manager is a disaster, and part of the reason that you've been given this meeting is because everyone, HR knows, and everyone knows it's a problem, and it's been very clearly set up that this is some kind of like lay it all on the table, what's going on kind of meeting, that's a separate issue. But assuming this is just like the skip level manager trying to understand what's happening in their org and trying to connect with other, like with employees, then just assume that anything you say is going to go back to your manager, so don't badmouth them. And that this is also your chance to make a good impression, because what also happens in calibrations for performance reviews for like medium and large size companies is that your manager is going to sit in a meeting with a bunch of their peers, and that skips like that next level of manager. And if that next level of manager has had some contact with you, even though this shouldn't really be the case, of course that's going to color how they weigh in on when it's Maria or Jessica and one's at a 3.3 and one's at a 3.4. They're going to be like, oh, but Maria, she seems to have spunk, right?
She's got that great doc.
Yeah. But again, like when you think about that meeting, when you go in, you don't want to, like, how nauseating would it be a meeting? Like I would hate to have a meeting with like someone in my org where they spend the entire meeting just bragging about what they did.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that would not come away with a good impression of them. But if you came to me and said, here's this project we're working on in Japan, and it's really interesting because this and this, and I was actually thinking it might be applicable in other countries, and you come in with like, even if it's a fake question, I was interested in knowing like how, when you're looking at the other areas that you're managing, right?
Hmm.
Are you seeing the same pain point that we're seeing over here? Or have you encountered this thing that we're trying to tackle over here? And guess what? That thing that you're about to say that you tackled, you did it, and you did it really well.
Yeah.
Um, so I think trying to approach that the same way as what I was saying
Mhm.
earlier might be helpful.
Yeah, and it almost seems like, if we're thinking about connecting it to how much you expand the Coda doc, all of that are things that you can then kind of distill. Like if I was presenting this to someone or sending this to them ahead of time, what would be those summary points I would want them to know? Well, I definitely want to
Right.
show them my goals, which there's already an area for you, and then creating that little summary of, hey, here's my stuff in a nutshell. Here's the goals I'm working on. Here's one project that's really top of mind, and being able to then again send that ahead of time so that that person can be like, oh, okay, I've got a basic understanding of your vocabulary, and then being able to run it just like you did before. I love that.
Yeah,
Thanks
I
for that
think
question,
you
Alice.
should have like an agenda for everything,
Hmm.
even dates. Just send an agenda in advance.
Yes. First, I would like to know, where did you go to college and what are you
Right.
studying, and then I would like to know what are you most passionate about in your job and your profession,
Right.
and then I would like to
Right.
know, do you have pets? And go from there. But yeah, I think it is in jest, but I really do feel that very strongly that having an agenda just makes everybody more likely to succeed, right?
Yeah, as an employee of anyone, I think you always want to go into any meeting knowing what you want to get out of it. So,
Hmm. Because otherwise, 30 minutes, you just wasted it, right? And
yeah, right.
we could be doing so many other things. Fantastic. So I'm thinking about, if you're a direct report or if you're a manager trying to bring in, changing a process, even though it might be a small change, what advice would you give to them as they're starting to maybe shop this around for their team or, their manager to maybe get started on a new way of doing a one-on-one? If this is going to be something new or an adjustment, what advice
I
would you
mean, if
give
they
them?
were trying to bring in this kind of process,
Yeah, yeah, making a change to an existing process. If there's already something in place, like, well, we just show up. What advice would you give for someone kind of trying to maybe institute a little more rigor?
well, I guess I would say that and maybe this is, I just haven't worked in a place that is very traditional. I feel like most places I've worked in, most places I've worked with, the managers have sufficient autonomy that if they wanted to try out like something like this, they
Hmm.
would just do it. And if
Yeah.
it was working really well, then they would end up sharing it with their coworkers. I mean,
Hmm.
this is not like a whole product roadmap template that's going to get super political and everyone
Yes.
wants to see their org represented on it, and and they're going to
Hmm.
argue over the color coding and stuff. So I actually feel like this is very simple. You start using it, and no doubt you'll find some categories that you don't want, or some
Hmm.
things you want to change, or you want to change the sentiment. But all this stuff
Yeah.
you were saying. So you would customize it to yourself, and then if it's working, then you just share it with people, I think, and
Hmm.
they'll start doing it too. I mean, I found that with Google in particular, people were very hungry for. There was such a huge information deluge that I think a lot of the people who succeeded were very good at project managing their own projects, but they did not always have the right framework or process for thinking about how to share that on with others or with their
Hmm.
manager because they were so consumed with the execution,
Right.
which is the more important part. But I think like if we going back, maybe we would have tried something like this if
Hmm.
I'd thought about it
Yeah.
then.
And would that advice change if you're a direct report or an individual contributor being like, my one-on-ones aren't so great. I want to try something new. Would it be similar or any adjustments?
I would think again, maybe it's very different in different companies, but I think that again, if I think of the last time I had a
Hmm.
manager, which was at Google, um, at no point did the CEO ever say to me, like, you need to send me an agenda, you need to send it to me in this format.
Hmm.
I just did it, right?
Yeah.
I think that for the most part, again, unless the company or your manager has laid out a very specific way that they want you to do it, as an individual contributor, you could take this and just start using it. Also, because since it appears as a regular email, like
Yeah.
it's again, I don't think there's anything controversial in it. I think you could
Hmm.
just start using it, and maybe your manager will be like, "This is kind of interesting,"
Yeah.
and they want to use it too. But
Yeah.
you could. That's what I'm trying to say is it can. You don't. It doesn't have to be reciprocal, right? Like you
Mhm.
can use it at the very minimum on the agenda side,
Right.
and the goal side. And maybe you can't use it on the expectation side because your manager doesn't want to play along. But the rest of it you could use, and it has zero negative impact on your manager. And I kind of only see
Yeah.
upside, so I don't see why you couldn't just use it.
Totally. Yeah, I didn't even think about the fact that you could just start using it for yourself. And because of that email, just sends it out. It's
Right.
almost like a no change, and that you can still be kind of easing yourself in while you're getting other people on board, and it still will work out just fine. You'll still
Yeah,
get
I feel
something.
like it like just feels very whizzy and impressed. I mean, the coding part is not like so whizzy, but I'm just saying that like all of a sudden this email appears in someone's
Oh,
inbox, and all the manager was expecting was like you coming in with a post-it note. They're like,
yeah.
oh, this person has their act together.
I've got
Since
these
so
three
much of
post-it
performance
notes.
management anyway is all like smoke and mirrors and making it
Mm-hmm.
look like you're doing fancier things than you are. I think this fits right in.
Yeah, I love that. Oh my goodness. So then, as far as Coda, have you been using Coda for anything else in your work or life?
Well, it's interesting since shifting over. So I was at Google for a while. I went into the startup, then I went back to Google, and then now I'm back in the startup. Um, and so it's very interesting because the processes you have in a really massive company are very different from what you need
Yeah.
when you are like a company of 5 people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we're not very heavy on templates or anything like that right
Right.
now. But the thing that I've been spending a lot of time on Coda looking at lately is just other ideas around distributed offices and distributed work. We've been distributed from the start, like we're
Mm-hmm.
in France and San Francisco. And so I'm always, I mean, when I was at Google, for the most part, when I had employees in remote offices, there were sort of two categories. You either want a smallish office, or I should say, you're in a normal sized office in, say, Paris,
Mm-hmm.
where yes, maybe my team was only 5 or 6 people there, but they were very, very connected to everything that the France
Right.
team was trying to
Right.
do. They had a ton of coworkers in France. But occasionally I would have employees that were like the one person in, in Dubai, or the one person in Bangkok.
Yeah.
And the needs of those employees are very, very different because they're so disconnected, and there might not even be anyone else
Yeah.
in the country representing the company at the time. And so the needs that they would have as remote employees were very, very different from, say, the Paris employees that I was just talking about. And so now, because of the situation we find ourselves in, some people are remote more in that kind of Bangkok
Yeah.
type use case rather than the Paris use case I
Mm-hmm.
named. And so finding ways to keep them connected and keep people interested and engaged without overloading them with like virtual trivia, birthday, happy hour, fun times.
Yes, like, look, we're people again. I promise. It's fun.
Yeah, to me is like is an interesting. I've been kind of, like Shashira has a good doc on it, and so
Mm-hmm.
I've been kind of looking around there just to see if there's any sort of new thinking about all of that. Since
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time doing that at Google, but again, it was a very different environment then. So
Yeah. Cool. Right on. Excellent. And then anything that you would like to plug? Anything you want people to check out? Obviously, it sounds like there's the Ask Jessica column on Medium, which sounds like it will be a gold mine of wonderful tips as well. But anything else that you want to like plug for the group that they should check out?
no, it feels so weird. I told you I'm not good at this stuff. You can do it for me, but
Okay.
I don't know. I guess you could, you know what? If you have any questions, here, this is in the spirit of I'm helping you, but I'm helping me. I'm bragging, but I'm not. Not
Hey.
really. It's not bragging to say you have a Twitter account. I have a modest Twitter account, which is at the Moco. So TheMoko. I'll just put it in the
At
chat.
the
If you
Moco.
ever have any questions, thank you.
Mhm.
Feel free to send them there, and I can either cover them in the column or I'm happy to answer you. Give you some weighty philosophical response in a short.
Love it.
But that, and then everything else you can just find. I think my bio is in the Twitter bio thing.
Awesome. Very cool. Any other final questions for Jessica, y'all? Let me know. Otherwise, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. I know it is our most precious resource, and I take that very seriously. And I know I've learned a lot of things. It was fun just nerding out on people science and people today with you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me. Thank you all for coming, even though I don't know who you are and I just see circles. You'll be bots. At least
They
you'll
could
be
all
bots
be.
with your agendas.
Yeah, but they're very friendly bots who now are going to have better expectations when they're working with their programs. Yes.
Excellent.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining us, everybody. We'll close out today. As always, the replays of this are on both our YouTube and our Crowdcast channel, so you can always relive the magic or share it with other folks in your network who you think might benefit. All right, if you need anything, you can always get in touch with me, Maria at Coda.io, or with our support team, support at Coda.io. You can check out all the docs that we have at Coda.io/gallery, and I've popped a link to Jessica's doc over there in chat. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you, Jessica. Have a great
Thanks.
rest of your day, y'all.